Dr. Manusala stood atop a makeshift platform of his own design, leaning precariously over the edge of a high tower in his old workshop on Earth. He adjusted the brass goggles strapped over his eyes and scowled at the reflection he caught in a piece of polished metal. The image showed a wiry, middle-aged man with hollow cheeks, wild brown hair streaked with silver, and an even wilder grin. Countless sketches and runes were inked onto every scrap of paper that littered his workshop floor. It had taken months to refine his invention, a bat-wing flight apparatus that would let him soar to unimaginable heights. But soaring high wasn't enough. No, this would be a test run. Soon, he would test it under conditions none had attempted before. Soon, he would be leaving Earth behind and traveling to the moon itself. He needed moon rocks. Fresh moon rocks brimming with lunerescence. They were a crucial final ingredient in the alchemical formula he had been perfecting to achieve his dream, to become a vampire, an immortal creature of the night. He had studied centuries-old grimoires, deciphered forbidden texts, and bartered for cursed reagents. He had tried countless prototypes, learning the hard way that simple bat wings were insufficient for the vacuum of space. With each failure, he'd redesigned the apparatus, adding a sealed breathing mask with an alchemical rebreather and a new propulsion device fueled by his carefully distilled concoctions. He had prepared himself with protective gear, and he wore a harness covered in etched runes to stabilize his magic energy in the void. The night before he departed, he stood alone in his workshop, candlelight dancing on his gaunt features. He gritted his teeth as he pored over a yellowed scroll that detailed the rumored savagery of the Lunerzons and their monstrous pets, the Mooniacs. They ruled the moon like pirate queens, raiding passing star traders, capturing men to serve as laborers, and breeding savage creatures to guard their encampments. Manusala had heard whispers that these warrior women tested their slaves in brutal tournament-like arenas, forcing them to battle for survival, entertainment, and submission. He clenched his fists. If such a challenge awaited him, he would overcome it. He had not come this far to fail. At dawn, with an earthbound crowd murmuring from a safe distance, Manusala activated his wings. The straps of black leather and iron tightened against his shoulders. The thin membrane of the wings glistened with alchemical oils. Alchemical wing thrust, nightbound ascent, he cried, channeling his prepared mana into the device. With a crack of energy and a thunderous boom, he leapt skyward. As if guided by a destiny only he could comprehend, he soared past the highest towers and vanished among the clouds. His breathing apparatus hissed softly, providing him with a sustainable air mixture as he ascended, and soon the sky began to darken into the infinite starry canvas of space. He navigated a treacherous asteroid belt that ringed the moon's orbit, an uncharted hazard that challenged his piloting skill. Asteroids swirled and clashed around him, each collision sending massive shards hurtling in unpredictable directions. He gritted his teeth, dodging left and right. The wings strained under the sudden changes in momentum. "No one shall stand between me and immortality," he roared as he applied extra propulsion, pressing a lever built into the harness. Batwing blitz, meteor dodge. He howled, spinning through a gap between two colliding asteroids. Metal scraped stone as one asteroid grazed the tip of his apparatus. Sparks flew, and Manusala's heart pounded. He pulled free, but the damage had been done. At last, he escaped the belt's deadly waltz and drifted gently down onto the moon's surface, the dusty gray landscape stretching endlessly before him. The landing was hard, the damaged apparatus sputtered, failing to slow his descent enough. He crashed into a small dune, rolling end over end until he came to rest, gasping for breath, heart hammering in his chest. He stood up slowly. His legs wobbled as he took in this eerie world. The horizon was crisp and curved, the sky was black, and distant stars shimmered with unnatural clarity. The sun's light blazed on one side of the landscape, but he saw it, the far horizon dipped into impenetrable darkness. The moon's slow rotation meant that half of it lay in perpetual twilight. That was where he would need to go to complete his ritual. The formula required darkness, for sunlight would spoil the delicate vampiric essence. First, however, he needed to find metal to repair his flying apparatus. He ventured forward, picking his way across the lunar dust. It didn't take long to find a suitable fragment of metal embedded into a large boulder. He tried prying it free with a crowbar, grunting as sparks flew. No good. He thought for a moment, then smiled. The lower gravity. He leapt high into the air, lifting the entire heavy stone with surprising ease, and threw it down with force. Moonsilver crash, he shouted for his own amusement, slamming it into the ground. The rock cracked, freeing the gleaming metal deposit. He knelt to harvest it, smiling at his resourcefulness. That's when the Mooniacs appeared. He heard them first, feral grunts and scraping feet kicking up lunar dust. He looked up to see them approach, short, stocky, muscular beings with thick arms and minimal necks. They howled in shrill, discordant tones, brandishing primitive clubs of metal and sharpened bone. Their eyes glowed red beneath the sun's harsh glare. "Stand back!" Manusala snarled, pushing his goggles up and brandishing a makeshift blade he hastily fashioned from a broken gear. "I have no quarrel with you. But if you dare test me..." They attacked in a flurry of howls. He leapt backwards, wings tucked behind him, and focused on his magical reserves. He had only rudimentary combat spells, but they would have to do. "Winged gale, dark gust," he shouted, sweeping his apparatus wings forward. A concentrated burst of alchemical wind erupted, scattering loose dust. Several Mooniacs toppled back, surprised. He lunged at the smallest one, slashing with his gear blade, and drove it back with a pained shriek. Another lunged from behind, but Manusala whirled and kicked off the ground, floating just enough to dodge the blow. He elbowed a second one in the face. It stumbled, spattering bluish saliva onto the lunar ground. But they were too many. For every Mooniac he drove back, 3 more rushed forward, yowling, eyes rolling madly. They converged on him, pinning his arms, forcing him to the ground. He struggled, shouting curses. He tried to ignite a second gust of wind, but the Mooniacs smothered his wings. He could feel their brute strength overwhelm him. With one final frantic cry, Manusala attempted to bite one of his captors, but it merely snarled and knocked him cold with a well-placed strike. When he awoke, he found himself in chains. A crude metal collar pinched his neck. Around him, a sprawling encampment of tents and rocky outcroppings spread across a plateau. Fires crackled, illuminating fierce silhouettes. He saw tall, wiry figures moving with predatory grace, Lunerzons, the moon's warrior women. They were exactly as the legends described, muscular frames, braided hair of various unnatural hues, crude but ornate platelets of metal armor strung together with sinew. Some carried swords that glowed faintly with imbued minerals, others wielded long spears. Laughter echoed through the camp as they surveyed their new prize, a captive man from Earth. Manusala's heart sank as he spotted his precious apparatus in their grasp. A Lunerzone chieftain stood at the center of the encampment's largest tent. She was tall, with intricate tattoos covering her bare arms, wearing a helmet fashioned from a Mooniac skull. She turned to him with a grin that revealed sharpened teeth. "So, you thought you could steal from us, Earthman?" she said in a rasping voice. "You come to our land and dare to claim our resources?" "I only needed a rock," Manusala spat. "I mean you no harm." He swallowed nervously, noting how the other Lunerzons eyed him hungrily, as if sizing him up for sport. "Let me go," he pleaded, "and I'll leave peacefully." His words only brought laughter. "I think not," said the chieftain. "We need more devices like yours. These wings. What a marvelous invention. With them, our raids across the starways would be much more profitable. You will build more for us, Earthman, or you will face the arena of no return." She pointed to a distant pit carved into the lunar soil, ringed by sharpened spikes. "That is where we test the worth of new slaves. If you fail to amuse us, you die. If you entertain us, we keep you. If you refuse, we simply kill you now." Manusala's jaw tightened. He needed to stay alive. He couldn't die here, he had come too far. If they wanted wings, he would give them something, at least for now. He nodded and lowered his gaze, pretending submission. They released him from most of his chains, keeping only the collar and wrist manacles that could be tightened at a whim. For days, they forced him to labor in a makeshift forge, using scraps of metal they looted from starships. He hammered and riveted under their watchful glare, constructing rudimentary flight devices. Not as refined as his own, but functional enough. The Lunerzons, however, grew impatient. They wanted to test his resolve. They arranged a grand event, a tournament to celebrate their latest spoils. Warriors from different Lunerzone tribes had assembled, bringing their fiercest Mooniacs and a handful of captive men forced to fight. Manusala was shoved into the pit with a groan of protest. The arena was a circular bowl of compacted lunar dust, ringed by jagged stones. Lunerzons crowded the perimeter, cheering and stamping their feet. Torches glowed in the lunar darkness, mixing with faint starlight. Drums thundered as the chieftain's voice rose above the din. "Let the grand lunar tournament commence. Show us your might. Show us your bloodlust." Manusala found himself standing across from a hulking Mooniac champion, easily 6 feet tall, with muscles like boulders. It held a heavy mace made from meteor metal. He swallowed, feeling his heart race. He had no wings this time, just his ragged clothes and a dented iron rod they'd tossed him. The crowd screamed for violence. The Mooniac champion charged, roaring its own name, Krarg. As if that were an attack. It swung the mace downward in a punishing arc. Manusala ducked to the side, rolling through the dust. "I won't die here," he snarled through clenched teeth. He mustered what little alchemical energy he had stored in his wrist bracers. Sparks fizzled. He slammed the rod into the ground and shouted, "Spark burst thrust." It wasn't much, just a crackling jolt of energy that caused dust to flare up. The Muniac paused, blinded for an instant, and Manusala capitalized, dashing in to strike at its kneecap with all his might. The rod bent, and the Muniac stumbled, bellowing in pain. The crowd was intrigued now. They chanted in guttural tones. The Muniac retaliated, swinging wildly. Manusala ducked under one blow and hopped back to avoid a second. Each blow shook the ground like a quake. He needed something more. Closing his eyes, he tried to remember his alchemical rune sequences. Back on Earth, he had prepared a few combat spells if he ever needed them. He drew a symbol in the dust with his fingertip and shouted, "Nocturne Lance, Pierce of the Night." A shimmering spectral lance, dark and translucent, formed at his side. He seized it and lunged forward, driving the lance into the Muniac's shoulder. The creature howled, staggering, but didn't fall. Now the crowd screamed louder, some impressed, others angry. The chieftain leaned forward, her eyes alight with interest. This Earthman had hidden depths. The Muniac tore the spectral lance from its flesh. It cracked and dissolved into wisps. The beast roared and raised its mace for a final blow. Manusala feinted left. As the mace slammed down, he sprang right, delivering a two-handed blow to the creature's head with his bent rod. A sickening crunch. The Muniac's eyes rolled, and it collapsed. Silence blanketed the arena for a moment, then erupted into cheers and jeers. The chieftain stood, raising her hand. "He survives," she declared. "But survival is not enough. He must prove his worth again." She beckoned, and two more contestants were brought forth. One was a terrified human captive forced to fight for a scrap of bread, the other was a small pack of feral Muniacs prodded by spear-wielding guards. Manusala's eyes widened. He didn't wish to kill a fellow human. The terrified man raised trembling fists. The Muniacs growled hungrily. The crowd demanded blood. Manusala lowered his rod and shouted to the other captive, "Join me, we can take down the Muniacs together. We can survive." But fear had consumed the man. He rushed Manusala with a cry of despair. Manusala dodged easily, pity twisting his heart. The Muniacs closed in. With a sweeping gesture, Manusala cried, "Wings of the bat," acoustic screech. He didn't have wings now, but he simulated the effect by clapping his bracers together, unleashing a sonic burst. The Muniacs howled and clutched their heads, stumbling. The human captive staggered, too, disoriented. Manusala punched the nearest Muniac, snatching a spear from its stunned grip, and swung in a wide arc, driving the rest back. The captive stared at him, confused. "We must not fight each other," Manusala urged. But the captive was too lost in terror to listen. He lunged again, tears streaming down his face, screaming lunar mercy. As if calling upon some unknown god. Manusala knew he had no choice. He sidestepped and struck the man's head with the spear shaft, knocking him unconscious rather than killing him. The crowd booed, displeased at his mercy. The Muniacs, however, had recovered and attacked from behind. One slashed Manusala's back with a jagged blade, drawing blood. He gasped in pain. Grinding his teeth, Manusala spun. Ebon pulse, Moonbreaker. He pressed the button on his bracer again, channeling what was left of his energy. A swirling vortex of dark energy erupted around him, sending 3 Muniacs flying into the arena walls. They collapsed, limp. The crowd was stunned into silence. Manusala, chest heaving, stood victorious. Though he had proven himself, the victory felt hollow. The Lunerzons dragged him back to the camp, where they imprisoned him once again, this time in a sturdier cage made from twisted alloys. The chieftain approached later that evening. "You are strong," she admitted, tapping her blade's edge against the cage bars. "Stronger than I expected. Build more wings for us, and you will live. We will host more tournaments soon, and you will fight again. Your spirit amuses me." Manusala nodded mutely. He had no choice. He spent the following days forging crude replicas of his Batwing device for the Lunerzons. But all the while, he plotted escape. He observed that the camp stood on the border between light and darkness. The Lunerzons clearly preferred the light side of the moon, where their solar-forged steel was stronger and their morale higher. The dark side beckoned him, for his vampiric alchemy required no sunlight. If he could reach the darkness and complete his final formula, he would gain the power to throw off these chains forever. One night, a skirmish broke out between rival Lunerzone tribes. The chieftain's warriors were distracted, their watchful eyes turned inward. Manusala took his chance. He bent a piece of metal he had hidden on his person, using it to pick the lock of his cage. With quiet determination, he slipped into the shadows and made a break for it. He raced across the threshold where the sunlight gave way to darkness. Without the harsh light, he could move stealthily, passing over ridges and leaping across small craters. The Lunerzons noticed his absence soon enough. They gave chase, cursing and shouting threats, brandishing torches and explosives that sent shivers through the ground. Manusala found refuge in a deep crater. He produced a small vial of carefully guarded alchemical fluid. He had smuggled it inside his harness lining. He set out his tools, a mortar and pestle carved from special lunar stone, a razor-sharp shard of moon rock he had managed to keep, and a book of runes etched into his mind. He mixed the lunar rock dust with essence of bat wings, blood of nocturnal beasts he had carried from Earth, dried and preserved, and the fluid he had distilled. If he drank this now, in the dark, he would become what he had always longed to be, an immortal vampire. He trembled as he poured the mixture down his throat. It burned like molten iron. He doubled over, gasping soundlessly in the vacuum. His vision swam, and he felt his heart slow, then race impossibly fast. His teeth ached and elongated into sharp fangs. His senses sharpened, he could feel the life forces of the pursuers approaching the crater. He hissed softly, rising from his crouch, feeling new strength flow through his limbs. A Lunerzone warrior peered over the crater's edge, torch held high. Before she could shout, Manusala leapt up with impossible speed. Nightfang slash, he cried, striking her with talon nails that tore through armor as if it were parchment. She screamed, blood spraying into the lunar dust. Another warrior hurled an explosive, but Manusala vanished in a blur of shadows, reappearing behind her. Crimson Moon Dive, he roared, tackling her from above and sinking his fangs into her neck. Hot blood filled his mouth, quenching the searing hunger that had ignited within him. She collapsed, limp. The remaining Lunerzons panicked. They fled, stumbling over one another. Manusala pursued them like a predator playing with prey. He had never felt so alive, so powerful. Each time he struck, he announced a new attack, delighting in his monstrous prowess. Vampire's embrace, shadow grip, he cried, conjuring spectral wings that trapped a terrified Lunerzone and drained her life force. They scattered, leaving only one survivor. She dashed back into the sunlight, screaming. The moment her foot touched the illuminated side, the sun's rays combined with the vampiric infection he had bestowed upon her. She turned to ash before she could raise an alarm. Manusala stood at the border, half in shadow, half in light, and laughed. He was immortal now, but he could feel the burning irritation of sunlight on his newly sensitive skin. He stepped back into darkness with a sneer. The Lunerzons were gone. He had bested them all. Yet he would starve without blood. He needed a stable supply. He remembered the Mooniacs. Simple-minded brutes, easily manipulated with the right approach. He focused on his new vampiric powers, on the hypnotic gaze legend spoke of. He ventured near the old camp, where scattered Mooniacs remained. They recognized him but didn't attack. Something about his presence now terrified and fascinated them. He lifted a hand and whispered, "Obsidian gaze, fealty of beasts." His eyes glowed red, and the Mooniacs whimpered, their wills bending. In time, he created a system. The Mooniacs would bring him fresh blood, other captured lunar creatures, perhaps, and maintain a population among themselves that he could feed on sparingly. He would not need to kill them all, just enough to sustain. Under his hypnotic control, they bowed to him, bringing armfuls of salvaged metals, captured weapons, and other resources from the abandoned Lunerzone stores. He oversaw the construction of a fortress on the dark side of the moon, a sprawling citadel forged from twisted metal and lunar rock. He adorned it with sharp spires that resembled bat wings, with glowing runes etched into the walls. Now he ruled as the vampire king of the moon's dark half. He spent nights drifting through its shadowed craters, plotting his next moves. He had begun his journey as a simple inventor, an alchemist obsessed with achieving vampirehood. His beliefs had changed. Before, he had sought immortality out of fear of death and a desire for greatness. Now he understood that immortality carried a terrible hunger. He had always thought that once he became a vampire, he would be free, but here he was, chained by his need for blood. Yet he took pride in his cleverness, in having outwitted and destroyed the Lunerzons who tried to enslave him. He reflected on the tournaments they forced him into, how he had hardened his resolve. Once he pitied the weak. Now, he regarded them with cold pragmatism. He was a king who would not hesitate to feed on others. He had grown darker, more ruthless, yet he believed this was necessary to survive in a universe of predators. Still, there was a whisper in the back of his mind, a memory of who he had been. He recalled the human captive he refused to kill outright in the arena. Somewhere deep inside, a fragment of compassion lingered. Perhaps, he thought, in the future he could find a better way to sustain himself without endless bloodshed. Such dreams were distant, he had a kingdom to maintain and a legacy to build. At the base of his new fortress, the Mooniacs dragged pieces of crashed starships into storage. Manusala inspected them carefully. He recognized insignias from distant realms, enemies of the Lunerzons who might one day come searching. Let them come. He would be ready. With his vampiric powers, with an army of enthralled Mooniacs, and with the knowledge he had gleaned, he could repel any invader. He smiled, baring his new fangs. He thought back to the day he left Earth. He remembered the old scrolls hinting that other sorcerers and alchemists existed, ones who had tried and failed to reach immortality. Perhaps some of them had succeeded and were out there still, waiting. Perhaps the Lunerzons were not the only threat. He had changed so much from that naive inventor who soared into space. Yet the universe was vast, full of secrets and horrors. He had settled one score, claimed a throne in shadow, but he knew more challenges lay ahead. In the distance, he sensed it, faint vibrations in the lunar soil. Ships were approaching from afar, unknown marauders, perhaps old allies or bitter enemies of the Lunerzons, come to reclaim what they thought was theirs. They would arrive soon, expecting to find Lunerzons and Mooniacs. Instead, they would find him, the Vampire King, and discover the terror that now haunted the moon's dark side. Manusala smirked and raised a hand to the starry void, as if saluting a future adversary. He whispered softly, his voice echoing in the silent darkness, "Come then, challengers. Come test my reign. I have won the tournament of survival, time to see who dares oppose me now." For indeed, there had been a time before all this, a story that led him to crave vampiric immortality, a story full of failed experiments and rival alchemists. He had left Earth behind unfinished rivalries and old grudges. They might seek him out eventually. And now, in his new throne, he awaited a sequel to the battles he had fought. The moon was his, at least half of it, and he would defend it with fang and claw, forging a future that would eclipse any mere mortal's dreams. So the Vampire King waited, dark wings folded, as the winds of the cosmos whispered of wars yet to come.